The morning Edith Beckett walked up to the doors of the Caldwell Savings and Trust, she had exactly three things holding her together: the deed to her late husband's land folded inside her coat pocket, a jaw set so firm it could have cracked stone, and a prayer that she would not cry in front of anyone who might use her tears against her. It was the spring of 1878, and the town of Caldwell, Kansas sat at the edge of everything a person could want and everything a person could lose. The cattle drives were still pushing north along the Kishom Trail, dust hanging in curtains over the flats, and the town itself was a patchwork of ambition and ruin, of men who had made fortunes and men who had died trying. The bank had only been open for 2 years, built solid with limestone blocks hauled from the quarry 12 miles east, and it wore an air of permanence that Edith had once found comforting and now found threatening. She was 31 years old. Her husband, Robert Beckett, had been dead for 4 months and 9 days. She had been counting, the way a person counts the days of a fever, watching for the moment when the counting itself would feel unnecessary. That moment had not arrived yet. Robert had been a good man with a gift for land and a weakness for credit. He had borrowed against their homestead 3 years ago to buy a second stretch of acreage adjoining their own, 120 acres of good grass with a spring-fed creek cutting through the middle of it. The plan had been sensible enough. The cattle market was strong, the grass was exceptional, and the loan terms were manageable on paper. But Robert had taken a kick from a horse that autumn and never fully healed, and the winter had been hard. And by the time the bank sent its first collection notice, Robert was already in the ground beneath the cottonwoods at the edge of the property he had loved so much. Edith had been managing the farm alone since then, with the help of her son, Thomas, who was 12 and growing fast but still only 12, and the occasional labor of a hired hand named Cruz who worked for modest wages and never complained, but who also could not be asked to do the work of 3 men. She had sold cattle. She had sold her good china, the set that had come all the way from her mother's house in Ohio. She had sold a matched pair of harness horses, and when she had tallied the figures on the kitchen table on a February night so cold the windows frosted on the inside, she had discovered that she was within reach. Not comfortable reach, not easy reach, but reach. She needed to walk into Caldwell Savings and Trust with enough money to settle the outstanding balance on the loan, and she needed to walk out with the deed in her hand, free and clear. That was the entire plan. That was the only plan. The morning was cool and bright. The sky the particular shade of pale blue that Kansas wore in early spring before the heat arrived and bleached everything to white. Edith had dressed carefully, not to impress but to arm herself. She wore her best dark wool skirt and the gray jacket with the good buttons that Robert had always liked. Her hair was pinned precisely. She wore no jewelry because she had sold most of it, but she had polished her boots until they held a shine that she was privately proud of. She arrived at the bank at 7:45 in the morning, 15 minutes before it opened, because she had not been able to sleep past 5, and had decided that arriving early was better than arriving rattled. She stood on the plank walkway in front of the double doors and watched the street come awake around her. A freight wagon rolled past, its driver half asleep on the bench. A woman shook a rug from an upstairs window across the street. Somewhere a rooster made his opinion known. She did not hear the man arrive behind her. She only became aware of him gradually, the way you become aware of warmth from a fire when you have been cold long enough that warmth feels remarkable. He was simply there, a presence at her back, solid and quiet. She did not turn around, because turning around would have meant acknowledging that she was aware of him, and she was not ready to acknowledge anything that was not strictly necessary to the task at hand. Luke Wilcox had not planned to be at the bank that morning. He had ridden into Caldwell the previous evening after 6 weeks on the trail, pushing a herd of longhorns up from Texas for a rancher named Hargrove, and he had intended to sleep late, eat something that was not beans cooked over a campfire, and then see about getting paid before Hargrove's accounting instincts got the better of his generosity. But the rooming house he was staying at had a window that faced east and a curtain that was more suggestion than barrier. And by 6 in the morning, the sun had made sleep a theoretical concept. He was 34 years old and had been working cattle since he was 17, first in Texas, and then wherever the work took him. He was not a large man in the way that men who spend their lives trying to appear large are large. He was simply substantial, broad through the shoulders and quiet in the way that comes from years of being the most reliable person in any given situation. He had dark hair and gray eyes, and a face that had been weathered by sun and wind into something honest and angular, and he had a manner about him that people noticed without always being able to explain why they noticed it. He had come to the bank because he wanted to deposit his wages somewhere safer than his saddlebag, before Hargrove's bookkeeper arrived with a reason to pay him less than what was agreed. He had a small account at the Caldwell Bank, opened 2 years earlier when he had been passing through on a different drive. It was a practical decision, not a sentimental one. But when he rounded the corner and saw the woman standing at the closed bank doors, something in her posture stopped him from doing what he would ordinarily have done, which was to lean against the wall and wait in his own comfortable silence. She was not leaning. She was standing straight, her hands folded in front of her face turned slightly toward the street. She had the look of someone who had been preparing for something difficult for a very long time, and was now in the final moments before that difficulty began. He had seen that look on men before a cattle crossing, on men before a hard negotiation, on men before something they knew might go wrong and were determined to face anyway. He had never quite seen it on a woman in a good wool jacket standing at a bank door, and the combination did something to his composure that he found slightly inconvenient. He stood behind her at a respectful distance and said nothing. There was nothing to say. She had not asked for company or conversation. But he did not step away either, and he was not entirely sure he could have explained why. At precisely 8 o'clock, a young man in a clerk's vest came around from the side of the building and unlocked the front doors with the expression of someone who had unlocked the same doors 400 times and expected to unlock them 400 more. He barely glanced at Edith before he pushed through ahead of her, which Luke noticed, and which he did not think was right, though he kept that opinion to himself. Edith walked through the doors. Luke followed. The interior of the bank was cool and smelled of paper and the faint mineral scent of the limestone walls. There were 2 teller windows, a writing table near the window, and at the back, behind a low gate of polished wood, the office of the bank manager, whose name, according to the painted lettering on the glass partition, was Mr. Gerald Combs. Edith went directly to the teller window, set her handbag on the counter, and said, in a voice that was composed and precise and carried not a single tremor in it, "I am Edith Beckett. I have an appointment with Mr. Combs regarding the settlement of the Beckett loan, account number 472. The teller, a young man with a thin mustache, consulted a ledger and then looked up with the careful expression of someone who had been told something in advance that he was not certain he wanted to relay. "Mrs. Beckett," he said, "Mr. Combs will be in shortly, if you would like to wait." "I would prefer to be seen," she said pleasantly, "but I am willing to wait briefly." Luke had moved to the writing table near the window. He was not eavesdropping deliberately, but the bank was quiet enough that he could hear everything, and he was paying attention in the way that a person pays attention when something feels important, even when they cannot yet say precisely what. Gerald Combs arrived 12 minutes later. He was a man in his mid-50s who wore good suits and a sense of his own importance the way other men wore hats. He had the practiced handshake of someone who shook many hands and remembered few of them, and when he came through the door and saw Edith Beckett at his teller window, something moved behind his eyes that was not entirely pleasant. "Mrs. Beckett," he said, with the particular warmth of a man who is warm when it costs him nothing. "Please come in." She followed him into his office. The gate clicked shut behind them. Luke could see them through the glass partition. Combs settling behind his desk with the ease of a man on his own territory. Edith sitting very straight in the chair across from him with her handbag in her lap. He did not intend to watch. He picked up one of the deposit slips from the writing table and began filling it out, but his attention kept drifting to the glass partition, because there was something in Combs's manner that was bothering him the way a small stone in a boot bothers you, not dramatically painful but impossible to ignore. Inside the office, Edith opened her handbag and removed a folded document and a small cotton pouch that she placed on the desk between herself and Gerald Combs. "I have the full amount," she said, $347.60, which is the outstanding principal plus the interest to date, calculated according to the original loan agreement. I have done the arithmetic 3 times. Combs looked at the pouch with an expression that she could not immediately read. He leaned back in his chair and folded his hands over his stomach, and she felt the first touch of cold unease move through her, because a man who had just been handed the resolution of a debt should not be leaning back in his chair with folded hands. "Mrs. Beckett," he said, "I am afraid there is a complication." She kept her hands still in her lap. "What complication?" "The bank's board has reviewed the outstanding accounts in the last quarter, and given the considerable period of non-payment, and the uncertainty of the property's management situation, the board has determined to assess an additional administrative fee of $120. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that has weight to it. "That fee is not in the original loan agreement," Edith said. Her voice was still steady. It cost her something to keep it steady, but she kept it. "It is within the bank's discretionary authority under the standard terms of the mortgage instrument," Combs said, and she could tell from the smoothness with which he said it that he had said it before, or practiced it, or both. "I would like to see the specific language in my loan agreement that grants the bank discretionary authority to add fees," she said. Combs paused. A brief pause, but she caught it and she filed it away. "The agreement is quite lengthy," he said. "I can have our clerk prepare a copy for your review." "I can read it here," she said. "Now, if you please, I have the time." Out at the writing table, Luke had stopped filling in his deposit slip entirely. He was watching the glass partition with full attention now. He could not hear the details of what was being said, but he could see Combs's posture and he could see Edith's posture, and the contrast between them was telling a story that he did not like the shape of. Combs retrieved the loan document from a file drawer and placed it in front of Edith, and she read it. She read every line, which took 9 minutes, and Combs waited with the patience of a man who believes time is working in his favor. When she finished, she looked up. "Mr. Combs," she said, "there is no provision in this document for an administrative fee of any kind. The terms specify principal, interest at 8% per annum, and a late payment penalty of 5% on any installment more than 30 days overdue, which I acknowledge is applicable and have included in my calculation. There is nothing here that supports a discretionary additional fee." Combs's expression did not shift significantly, but something in the set of his jaw changed. "As I said, the board has the authority. I am not disputing the board's general authority," Edith said, and her voice had taken on a clarity that was remarkable to hear, quiet and precise as a knife being set on a table. "I am saying that the specific fee you have described is not supported by this specific contract, and I believe that if I were to present this contract and your claim to a county judge, the judge would agree with me." The office was very quiet. Luke, from his position at the writing table, could not see Edith's face, but he could see Combs's, and he watched the banker weigh things. The calculation happening behind Combs's eyes was visible if you knew how to read it, and Luke had spent 17 years reading men in situations where reading them correctly was the difference between a good outcome and a bad one. Combs was deciding whether Edith Beckett would actually go to a county judge. He was calculating the probability that a widow, alone, managing a farm with a 12-year-old son and no legal representation, would have the knowledge and the resources and the nerve to pursue such a thing. Luke set down his deposit slip. He walked to the low gate, opened it quietly, and knocked once on the frame of the open office door. Both Combs and Edith turned to look at him. Combs with irritation, Edith with an expression that was harder to read, something careful and measuring in it. "Beg your pardon," Luke said, addressing Combs with a directness that was entirely courteous and entirely unmistakable. "I couldn't help but overhear. I'm acquainted with Judge Hartwell in the county seat. Good man, very thorough when it comes to contract law, has a particular interest in ensuring that lending institutions honor the precise terms of their agreements. I've testified before him twice." He let that sit for a moment. "Just thought that was worth mentioning. It was a bluff, partly. He did know a man named Hartwell who was a justice of the peace 2 towns over. Whether Hartwell would take an interest in bank contract disputes was speculative, but the information was true enough in its bones, and the delivery of it was the kind of steady, flat-eyed certainty that made men of Gerald Combs's nature recalculate." Combs looked at Luke. Luke looked back at him with the calm of a man who has stood in difficult situations and found them manageable. "I believe," Combs said, after a pause that was just long enough to reveal that the pause was deliberate, "that there may have been a miscommunication about the nature of the assessment. Let me review the account again." He reviewed the account again. It took 4 minutes, and at the end of those 4 minutes he accepted Edith's $347.60, had the loan marked as settled in full in the ledger, and produced the deed to the Beckett homestead, stamped and signed and free of any encumbrance. Edith held the deed in both hands for a moment before she folded it and placed it in her coat pocket. She had not cried. She had not come close to crying. She was, in that moment, the most composed person in the room, and possibly the most composed person in Caldwell, Kansas. She thanked Combs in a tone that was perfectly polite and perfectly final, gathered her things and walked out through the low gate, through the lobby, and out the front doors into the morning sun. Luke followed at a natural distance, not crowding her, not presuming. She stopped on the plank walkway and turned to face the street. Her hand went to her coat pocket and rested there over the place where the deed sat, and she closed her eyes for just a moment. Her chin lifted slightly, as if she were letting herself feel the full weight of what had just happened, and then deciding how to set it down and carry on. Luke stopped a few feet away. He put his hat on, which he had been holding since entering the bank, and settled it on his head and looked out at the same street she was looking at. "Thank you," she said, without turning to look at him. Her voice was quieter now, the precision of it softened slightly, though no less clear. "You had it handled," he said. "You knew the contract better than he did." She turned then. She looked at him directly, and he looked back at her, and the morning light was doing something useful with the angles of the day. "Perhaps," she said, "but a witness changes the calculation for a man like that." "It does," he agreed. A beat passed between them, not uncomfortable, not ordinary either. "I am Edith Beckett," she said, "and I already know more than I intended to about your acquaintance with Judge Hartwell." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "Luke Wilcox," he said, "and Hartwell's a justice of the peace who once ruled in a cattle dispute. Whether he'd look at a bank contract is the kind of thing I made sound more certain than it was." She looked at him for another moment, and then she laughed. It was not a large laugh, not theatrical. It was the laugh of someone who has been holding a great deal together for a long time and just found one small thing that could be set down, and the sound of it was warm and entirely genuine. "Well," she said. As bluffs go, it was well timed. "I have my moments," he said. She looked back at the street. The freight wagon that had passed earlier was coming back from the other direction, now loaded. The rooster had given up his commentary. The day was opening up into itself. "I have a long drive back to my property," she said, and then, as if the words surprised her slightly as she said them, "Would you like to have coffee first? There is a decent establishment 2 doors down, and I believe I owe you at least that much." Luke considered refusing, because she did not owe him anything, and he thought about saying so. But there was something in the way she had extended the invitation, straightforward and self-possessed, and entirely without coyness, that made refusing seem like the less honest response. "I would," he said. They walked the 2 doors down to Haverson's, which was a clean establishment with 4 tables and a counter and a woman behind the counter named Me who poured coffee with the generosity of someone who understood that coffee in the morning was a kindness and not merely a transaction. They sat across from each other at a table near the window, and the coffee came, and they drank it and they talked. Edith told him about the farm, not with complaint but with the matter-of-fact clarity of someone describing terrain. She told him about Robert, briefly, enough to account for his absence and no more, because grief was hers, and she was not in the habit of laying it out for strangers. She told him about Thomas, who was 12 and sensible, and had taken to managing the chickens with an authority that she found both admirable and slightly alarming. Luke told her about the drive up from Texas. He told her about Caldwell, which he had passed through before but never stayed in. He told her he had been thinking vaguely about what came after the trail, about land, about something that stayed put, though he said this last part in the way of a man who is still deciding whether to believe it himself. The coffee cups were refilled once. Then the cups were empty. Edith looked at the window at the angle of the light and began gathering herself. "I should start back," she said. "Thomas will have finished his morning chores and will be wondering." "How far is the property?" Luke asked. "About 7 miles northeast," she said. "There's a good road most of the way." He nodded. He had the particular stillness of a man who is deciding something but is not yet sure he has permission to decide it. "I am going to be honest with you," he said, "because you seem like someone who prefers honesty to ceremony." He paused just briefly. "I would like to call on you if that is something you would consider, properly, with your awareness and your consent, not to intrude on anything that is still." He stopped and found different words. "It's been 4 months and that's your time to reckon with, not mine. I am not trying to rush anything. I only know that I would like to sit across from you again, and I thought you should know that." She looked at him for a long moment. There was nothing coy in how she looked at him. She was a woman who had just walked into a bank, held her ground against a man trying to take her land, and walked out with what was rightfully hers. She was not going to be flustered by a direct sentence. "It has been 4 months," she said slowly, "and I am still reckoning with it. But I am also a practical woman with a farm to run and a son to raise, and a great deal of work that does not pause for the reckoning." She folded her hands around her empty coffee cup. "I think I would not be opposed to you calling on me, properly, as you said." He nodded, and the corner of his mouth did the thing again. "Then I will." She wrote the directions to the farm on the back of a receipt from her handbag, which she handed to him with a practicality that he found more appealing than any amount of ceremony could have been. Then she stood, settled her jacket, shook his hand with a firm grip that surprised him slightly, and walked out into the morning. Luke sat for a moment after she left, holding the directions in one hand and his empty coffee cup in the other, looking at the door she had gone through. Then he folded the paper carefully and put it in his shirt pocket, paid Me for both coffees over Me's gentle insistence that it was not necessary, and walked out into the day with the particular quality of attention that a man has when something has shifted, and he is not yet sure how large the shift is going to be. He collected his wages from Hargrove's bookkeeper that afternoon, which turned out to be a modest argument that he won without raising his voice. He visited the general store and resupplied. He wrote a letter to a man named Duval in Texas who had offered him work in the autumn, and told him that his plans had become uncertain in an agreeable way. Then he went back to the rooming house, sat on the edge of the narrow bed with the east-facing window, and looked at the piece of paper with Edith Beckett's handwriting on it until the light got too low to see clearly. He waited 4 days before riding out to the farm, not because he was uncertain, but because he thought that showing up the next morning would be too much, and he wanted to be the kind of man who was not too much. The property was exactly as she had described it in terms of distance and direction, and considerably better than he had imagined in terms of everything else. The farmhouse was solid, white-painted wood with a wide porch, set on a low rise above a creek that caught the light in ways that would have pleased any painter who happened to be passing through. The fields around it were green and beginning to grow. There were cattle in the near pasture, not many but enough to suggest the beginnings of a rebuilt herd. A dozen chickens conducted their affairs in a fenced yard beside the house with great self-importance. He was still 20 yards from the fence gate when the door of the house opened, and a boy came out onto the porch and looked at him with the frank, unguarded assessment that only children and very honest adults are capable of. This was Thomas. He had Edith's coloring and what appeared to be his own very particular expression, which communicated that he was interested but not easily impressed. "You must be Mr. Wilcox," Thomas said. "Mama said you might come by. She said you helped her at the bank." "She did most of the helping herself," Luke said, dismounting and looping his horse's reins over the fence post. "I was mainly present." Thomas considered this. "She said that too," he said, in a tone that suggested he found the confirmation interesting. Then he stepped back and opened the door wider. "She is in the kitchen. I will tell her you are here." Luke waited on the porch, hat in his hand, looking out over the property. The afternoon was warm and the air smelled of new grass and water, and somewhere across the creek, a meadowlark was performing with more enthusiasm than technical precision, but making up for it with commitment. Edith appeared in the doorway, and she was wearing a blue dress he had not seen, and her hair was somewhat less formally pinned than it had been at the bank, and she looked, he thought, like someone who had been working all morning and had not stopped being herself for even a moment of it. "Mr. Wilcox," she said, "you came." "I said I would," he said. "People say many things," she said, but she was smiling as she said it, and the smile did something to the line of her mouth that he found he needed to look at for a moment before he could look away. "Come in," she said. "Thomas has put the kettle on. He is very proud of this." The kitchen was warm and smelled of bread that had been baked earlier in the day, and Thomas was indeed monitoring the kettle with the seriousness of a young engineer. There was a table with 4 chairs, and they sat at 3 of them, and they drank tea, and Luke answered Thomas's questions, which were direct and numerous and covered the following topics in approximately this order: how many cattle he had driven north, what the weather was like in Texas, whether he had ever seen a rattlesnake up close, what he thought of the Caldwell Marshal, and whether he could tell by looking at a horse's teeth how old it was. Luke answered every question fully and honestly, and Thomas listened with the focused attention of someone filing information away for future use. After an hour, Edith sent Thomas to see about the evening feeding of the chickens, which he went to do with only minor negotiation, and then it was quieter in the kitchen, and Edith poured more tea and looked at him across the table. "He likes you," she said. "He does not always." "He has good judgment," Luke said. "He does," she agreed. "He has Robert's way of seeing people clearly and my way of not hiding what he sees." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "Did you find your work here in Caldwell resolved?" "Mostly," he said. "I am between drives at the moment, not entirely sure what comes next." She looked at him with that clear, measuring quality he had noticed at the bank. "You mentioned land," she said, "when we had coffee." "I did," he said. "There is a tract adjacent to mine," she said carefully. "The 80 acres on the east side that Robert had intended to purchase before things went the way they did. It is held by a family named Prout who are moving to Colorado. I believe they would sell at a reasonable price." He looked at her steadily. "Are you suggesting I buy land next to yours?" "I am suggesting that 80 acres of good grass with a creek access is available, and that you mentioned you were considering land," she said. "What you do with that information is your own affair." He was quiet for a moment. "That is a practical suggestion," he said. "I am a practical woman," she said, "as I believe I mentioned." "You did," he said. "I remember it." He visited twice more in the following 2 weeks. On the second visit, he repaired a section of fencing along the north pasture that Thomas had identified as a problem, and that Edith had been working around because she did not have the materials. He arrived with the materials, which he had bought at the hardware store in town, and he and Thomas worked on it for most of a morning, while Edith brought them water and expressed exactly the right amount of gratitude, which was enough to be genuine and not so much as to make him uncomfortable. On the third visit, he stayed for supper, which Edith cooked with no fanfare and which was excellent. A roasted chicken with potatoes and early spring greens from the kitchen garden, and they sat at the table long after the plates were cleared, and the candles had burned down to half and Thomas had fallen asleep in his chair by the stove, and they talked about things that mattered, not about the farm or the cattle market or the practical arrangements of the world. About what they believed, what they had wanted when they were young, what they still wanted. About what it was to lose someone and continue anyway. About what it was to choose a direction in life and then have the ground shift under your feet and have to find your footing again. Luke told her things he had not told many people. About growing up in East Texas with a father who worked himself into the ground for a piece of land he never fully owned and a mother who sang, while she cooked no matter what else was happening. About deciding at 17 that he would rather move than be still, and about the years on the trail that had been full and fine and also, in some quiet way, incomplete. Edith listened the way she did everything, fully and without performance. And when she spoke, her words had the particular quality of someone who has thought seriously about what is true and is not willing to say anything that is less than that. Thomas woke briefly around 9, determined that no one needed him, and went to bed with the dignity of a boy who has been falling asleep in chairs for years and has made his peace with it. After the sound of his footsteps on the stairs faded, the quiet in the kitchen was different. Warmer, maybe. More particular to the two people who were in it. "You should know," Edith said, "that I am not entirely sure what I am doing." She said it plainly, with her hands flat on the table. "I spent 11 years being one kind of person in one kind of life, and now I am something different, and I have not finished figuring out what that something different is." "That seems reasonable," Luke said. "I am not sure it is entirely fair to you," she said. "I am not in a hurry," he said, "and I am fairly certain what I am feeling, which I will not say yet because I think it is too soon and you have said you are still figuring things out, and I would rather be useful than precipitate." She looked at him for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted, softened, became something that was still careful but was also reaching toward warmth. "You are a strange man, Luke Wilcox," she said. "Probably," he said. "I mean it as a compliment," she said. "I took it as one," he said. He rode back to town in the dark, which was fine because his horse, a steady brown mare named Patience, knew her own way and did not require management in familiar conditions. The stars over the Kansas plain were extraordinary in the way they always were when the air was clear, and he rode under them feeling something he had not felt in a long time, something that had the quality of rightness to it, like a piece of ground that your boot finds solid when you expect it soft. He bought the Prout land 2 weeks later. He paid a fair price for 80 acres of good grass with creek access on the east side, and the Prouts went to Colorado with their wagon loaded and their minds easy, and Luke stood at the edge of his new property on a Tuesday afternoon in May, and looked at the grass and the creek and the edge of the Beckett farm visible through the trees to the west, and thought that he had not made a mistake. He broke ground on a small house that summer. He hired 2 men from town who were between jobs, a man named Parsons who was a capable carpenter, and his brother-in-law Aldous who was a capable anything if given specific instructions. And together, the 3 of them put up a house that was simple but solid, with good walls and a sound roof, and a porch that faced west because west was the direction of the best light at the end of the day. Edith came to look at it when the walls were up. She walked through it with the practical eye of someone who has run a household and knows what a house needs, and she made 2 suggestions, both of which were good. one about the placement of the kitchen window and one about the depth of the root cellar, and he incorporated both without debate, because they were correct. Thomas came too and declared the whole project excellent, and asked to help with the porch railing, and was given a hammer and supervised closely by Parsons, who had the patience of a man who had raised 4 children of his own. The work of the summer was good. Luke spent his days building his place and often his evenings at Edith's table, or walking the fence lines with her, or sitting on her porch while Thomas told them about the book he was reading, which changed every few weeks and ranged from a history of the American frontier to a novel about a sea voyage that Thomas was finding implausible but compelling. The courtship, because that is what it was, proceeded with the same quality that Edith brought to everything: careful, genuine, and free of pretense. She did not play games with him, and he did not play games with her, and the absence of games meant that what grew between them was not something dramatic or sudden, but something that had the weight of the real. He kissed her for the first time on an evening in late June, when they were walking the creek bank behind her house in the last of the day's light. They had been talking about something small, the health of a particular cow he had bought for his new herd, and then they had both stopped talking at the same moment, and the quiet between them had that quality again, and he had turned to look at her, and she had already turned to look at him, and there was nothing in the moment that required decision because it was simply what came next. She kissed him back without hesitation, and with the same honesty she brought to everything else, and the creek made its sound behind them and the light went from gold to pink above the trees, and when they stepped back, they were both looking at each other with the particular expression that people wear when something has become clear that was previously uncertain. "I think," she said, "that I am no longer figuring out what I am." She paused. "Or perhaps I am, but I know what I want to be figuring it out alongside." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face, which the evening breeze had moved, and he said, "I would very much like to be that." The summer deepened, and the prairie heat arrived as it always did, intense and honest. Luke's cattle settled into the new land and began doing well. Edith's herd grew by 12 head from a purchase. She negotiated herself at the livestock exchange in town, getting a better price than 3 men who had tried before her that morning, which the livestock dealer mentioned to Luke with a combination of bewilderment and respect when Luke came through 2 days later. The people of Caldwell were aware of the development between Luke Wilcox and Edith Beckett in the way that small towns are aware of such things, through accumulation of small observations rather than any announcement. Me at Haverson's noticed that they had coffee together on Saturdays. The woman who ran the dry goods store noticed that Luke bought yard goods in colors that were not his own. Parsons and Aldous, who had gone on to other work, mentioned to their wives that the Wilcox place was being built with a kitchen that was considerably more thoughtful than a bachelor usually required. Nobody said much, because Caldwell had its own protocols about such things, and because Edith Beckett had made it clear in small, firm ways since her husband's death that she appreciated consideration and did not appreciate interference. There was one complication, and it arrived in August. A man named Harker, who had a spread 3 miles south and who had been, in the months following Robert's death, quietly suggesting to various parties that the Beckett farm might come available if the widow could not manage the debt, came to see Edith on a Wednesday morning with the official air of someone who believes that circumstances have entitled him to something. He arrived in a good buggy and knocked at the door and asked to speak with her on a matter of business. She let him in because she was a hospitable person and sat across from him at the kitchen table with the same composed directness she brought to everything. Harker was a man of 50 who had land and money, and the particular confidence of someone who had spent his adult life having both. He was not a bad man exactly, but he had a way of measuring things in terms of his own advantage that made the world around him smaller than it actually was. He told her with elaborate courtesy that he had heard her loan was settled, which he congratulated her on, and that he was aware she was managing the property with limited help, which he acknowledged was challenging, and that he wanted her to know that if she ever found herself considering a sale, he would make her a fair offer for the property. He then mentioned, with a subtlety that was not very subtle, that a woman alone with a young son and a farm was a considerable burden, and that there were other possibilities for a woman of her quality, and that he himself was a widower, and that he had considerable regard for her. Edith listened to all of this with perfect patience and then said, in the calm and precise way that he had clearly not expected, "Mr. Harker, I appreciate your courtesy. The farm is not for sale. It was not for sale when my husband died. It was not for sale when the bank tried to add unauthorized fees to my loan, and it is not for sale now. As for the other matter, I am obliged to tell you that my personal situation has become, in recent months, less solitary than it may appear, and I do not anticipate that changing." Harker looked at her for a moment, recalibrating. "Wilcox," he said, with the tone of a man who had already done his accounting. "Good day, Mr. Harker," she said. He left. She watched his buggy go down the lane from the kitchen window, and then she put on her work gloves and went out to the garden, because the beans needed attention, and she was not going to let Harker take time from her that the beans needed. She told Luke about it that evening. He listened with the attentive quiet that she had come to know was not passive but was simply how he processed things that mattered. "Did he upset you?" Luke asked. "He irritated me," she said, "which is different. He is a man who confuses advantage with entitlement, which is a common enough failure. He did not frighten me." "No," Luke agreed. "I don't imagine he did. I want you to know," she said, "that I told him my situation had become less solitary, because it has. I was not claiming something we have not discussed." "We can discuss it," he said. He was looking at her steadily. "Edith, I want to marry you. I have wanted it for some time, and I have been waiting for the right moment. And I think the right moment might be when you have just sent Harker on his way, because you have just demonstrated again that you are exactly the person I believe you to be." She looked at him across the porch railing where they were both leaning, watching the evening come down over the fields. "I want to marry you too," she said. "I have been waiting for you to ask." "You could have asked me," he said. "I was aware of that," she said. "I was curious whether you would." Something genuine and warm moved through him, and he laughed, a full real laugh, and she laughed too. And then he reached across the space between them and took her hand, and she let him. And the evening came down over the fields of what was, for the first time in a long while, feeling to both of them like a complete life rather than a partial one. They were married in October of 1878, on a Saturday, in the small church on the east side of Caldwell. The ceremony was conducted by a reverend named Coleman, who performed it with appropriate brevity and genuine warmth. Edith wore her best dress, which she had let out slightly at the waist and altered at the collar with a piece of cream-colored lace that had been her mother's, and which she had kept through all the selling, because some things are not for selling. Luke wore his good jacket and a new shirt, and had his hair cut properly at the barber's the day before, and he stood at the altar with the calm of a man who is exactly where he intends to be. Thomas stood beside them as witness, wearing his church clothes and an expression of serious satisfaction. Me from Haverson's was there. Parsons and Aldous were there with their wives. Cruz, who had worked the farm for Edith through the hard months, and who had been told by Luke that his job was secure as long as he wanted it, was there in a clean shirt with his hat in his hands. After the ceremony they went back to the Beckett farm, which was now also the Wilcox farm, and me and Mrs. Parsons had organized a supper while the ceremony was happening, and there was food enough for twice the people present and music from a fiddle player named Du Bois who had been hired for the occasion, and who played with the uncomplicated joy of someone doing the thing he was put on earth to do. Thomas danced with his mother. Edith danced with Luke, who was not a natural dancer but moved with enough of his fundamental quality of attention that it did not matter. Luke danced with me, who declared him a fine partner, and with Mrs. Aldous, who declared the same thing and added that they were a lovely match, and that she had said so to Aldous from the beginning, which Aldous confirmed with equanimity. The night was warm for October, and they left the windows open, and the fiddle music went out into the dark over the fields, and the prairie absorbed it the way it absorbed everything, without judgment, as part of the ongoing record. They moved between the two houses through the winter, spending more time at the Beckett farm because it was larger and Thomas was established there, and working it out practically, the way practical people work out practical questions, with conversation and adjustment and no particular drama. Luke's house on the adjacent 80 acres became the working base for his cattle operation, and Parsons came back in the spring to add a proper barn to it, and the two properties functioned increasingly as one, which was what made sense geographically and what both Luke and Edith had, in their individual quiet ways, always been imagining. The winter was good. Not easy, because winters in Kansas were not easy, but good in the way that the hard and the warm can coexist when you have someone to share both. Luke learned the particular rhythms of the Beckett farm, which were Edith's rhythms, and she learned his, and Thomas was the constant thread between them, demanding nothing dramatic and offering everything genuine. Thomas was 13 in January, and went on growing with the uncomplicated velocity of a boy who has made peace with the world, and intends to meet it directly. He and Luke had developed a friendship that neither of them would have called friendship aloud, but that was evident in the way they occupied the same spaces, in the arguments they had about horse management, and the comfortable silences they shared on long fence-line walks, in the way Thomas sometimes appeared at Luke's elbow during difficult tasks without being asked, as if he simply understood that two people handling something was better than one. Luke never tried to replace Robert Beckett. He was too honest and too sensible for that, and besides, Edith would not have tolerated it, and Thomas would not have either. What he offered instead was a consistent and genuine presence, and over time that presence became woven into the fabric of the household in a way that was neither intrusive nor detached, but simply there, which was perhaps the most that could be asked. In the spring of 1879, Edith discovered that she was expecting. She told Luke on a Tuesday evening when Thomas was in his room and the house was quiet. She was matter-of-fact about it, because she was matter-of-fact about most things, but there was something in her face when she said it that was different from her ordinary composure, something that was purely glad, and he saw it and felt something corresponding move in his chest that he was fairly certain would have embarrassed him if anyone else had been in the room. He stood up from the chair he had been sitting in and crossed to where she was standing at the kitchen table and put his arms around her, and she let him, and for a moment they were simply still together in the quiet kitchen while the candles burned and the prairie dark pressed in at the windows. "Are you well?" he asked. "Very well," she said into his shoulder. "Tired, but very well." "Then we are in excellent shape," he said. The pregnancy was without significant complication. Edith continued to work the farm and the kitchen garden and manage the household accounts with the same competence she always had, making adjustments as she became less comfortable with certain tasks and accepting help without the kind of resistance that pride sometimes makes people perform. Cruz took on more of the heavy work without being asked, because he had a good eye and a decent heart. Thomas took over the daily chicken management entirely, which the chickens did not seem to notice. Luke was steady throughout, which was what she needed and also what she would have been correct to predict about him. He was not a man who expressed concern through hovering or anxiety through performance. He was simply more careful, more present, more attentive to the details of how she was managing, and when she needed something, he was generally 2 steps ahead of the need. Their son was born in November of 1879, during a cold snap that frosted the windows of every building in Caldwell and made the midwife, a competent woman named Mrs. Abrams, wrap the baby in 2 blankets immediately upon his arrival in the world. They named him James Robert Wilcox. The Robert was for Edith's first husband, which Luke had suggested without prompting, because it was right and he knew it was right, and he was not a man who was made smaller by doing the right thing. The James was for Luke's father, who had worked himself into the ground for a piece of land he never fully owned and who had deserved, in his son's private opinion, a good deal more than he had received. James Robert arrived in the world with emphatic lungs and dark hair, and the kind of fierce attention to his immediate environment that suggested he was going to have opinions about it. Thomas came in to see him within 20 minutes of his birth, stood at the bedside with his arms crossed, and looked at his new brother with an expression that moved through several phases before arriving at something that was clearly and unmistakably love, though he would not have called it that aloud for several years. The following spring, 1880, Caldwell was still very much a trail town, still receiving the great northward push of longhorns from Texas, still loud and energetic, and full of the constant churn of men and cattle and commerce. But things were changing, and both Luke and Edith could see it. The way the change in the land uses around them was slowly reshaping the character of the territory, the homesteads spreading, the open range contracting, the permanent structures of a settled community beginning to outnumber the temporary ones. Luke made a decision that spring to stop taking trail drives entirely. It was not a sacrifice. He had savings. He had his 80 acres with a growing herd, and he had the Beckett farm to manage jointly with Edith, and the combination of those things was more than enough work and more than enough life. He told Edith on a morning in April when they were both standing at the fence looking at the new grass coming up, and she said, quietly, "I am glad," and he knew she meant it, and that was enough. The injustice that Combs at the bank had attempted that morning the previous year had not gone entirely unremarked. Luke had, in the weeks following, spoken quietly to one of the other members of the bank's board, a reasonable man named Fletcher who had a daughter on a homestead and understood what it meant to have a bank take advantage of a vulnerable situation. Fletcher had taken the information seriously, had raised it internally, and Combs had not lost his position but had, from what Luke was told, received a very pointed conversation about the limits of his discretionary authority and the importance of honoring precise contract terms. It was not a dramatic resolution. It was not the stuff of heroic stories. But Edith had said when Luke told her that real justice usually looked like that, quiet and functional and without ceremony, and he thought she was probably right. Thomas turned 14 that January and began talking about a future that involved working the land, which pleased Luke and Edith both, though Edith made sure that he also continued his studies, because she had strong feelings about the importance of education that she communicated firmly and without apology. Thomas accepted this the way he accepted most of his mother's positions, which was with some negotiation but ultimate agreement, because he had long since concluded that her judgment was generally correct. James Robert was 6 months old and developing a personality that was already clearly distinct from everyone else in the household. He was interested in everything and vocal about all of it, and had a laugh that stopped whatever room he was in. Thomas, who had been an only child for 14 years and might have been expected to take some time adjusting to company, had instead adapted to his brother with a thoroughness and affection that was both touching and practical, spending his evenings reading aloud to James Robert from whatever book he was currently working through, regardless of whether James Robert could understand it, on the theory that the sound of reading was good for him, and the practice of reading aloud was good for Thomas. In the summer of 1880, Edith planted a larger kitchen garden than she had the previous year, extending it along the south side of the house to include a section she had been planning since the previous autumn. Luke built her a proper garden fence, good and tight, to keep the chickens out, which had been a source of periodic minor conflict between Edith and the chickens for years. The garden fence resolved it entirely in Edith's favor. They worked the land together through that summer with the particular ease of two people who have learned each other's ways and found them compatible, who have had their arguments and resolved them, and come out the other side knowing each other better. They disagreed sometimes about cattle management, and sometimes about money and once, rather memorably, about the location of a new stock water tank, an argument that lasted 3 days and ended when they walked the property together with a measuring rope, and discovered that Edith had been correct about the gradient and Luke had been correct about the soil drainage, and the right location was 3 yards from where either of them had originally suggested. They had laughed about it for days afterward, and it became a reference point they returned to when subsequent disagreements arose, a reminder that the truth was usually somewhere that required both of them to find it. The town of Caldwell had its own ongoing drama during those years. The cattle trade brought prosperity, and it also brought roughness, and the streets were not always peaceful, and the marshal's office dealt with more than it probably should have been required to deal with. Luke stayed largely clear of town troubles because he had enough to occupy him, and because Edith was right that a quiet life well lived was worth more than involvement in the particular chaos that a trail town generated. But he was not invisible either. When there was a community matter that required steady men to stand and be counted, he was one of them, and people in Caldwell knew that and respected it. There was a difficulty in the autumn of 1880, when a man riding through decided that Luke's south pasture fence was an inconvenience to his preferred route and took down a section of it. Luke found the damage and the tracks the next morning. He followed them, because it was his fence and his pasture, and he was not going to pretend otherwise. He found the man camped at the creek and had a conversation with him that was direct and unambiguous, and resulted in the fence section being repaired, and the man continuing his journey in a different direction. No violence occurred. The man understood that certain things were very clearly stated and that proceeding further would have consequences, and he was not interested in consequences. Edith asked him about it when he came back, and he told her, and she said, "Good," in the tone she used when something had been handled correctly, and she did not need to discuss it further. Their daughter arrived in February of 1882. Her name was Clara Mee Wilcox, the me being for the woman at Haverson's who had poured their first coffee together on that morning after the bank, a fact which Mee received with what she described as the finest thing that had happened to her in a good while, and which caused her to kiss Edith on both cheeks and Luke on the top of his head, because she was shorter than he was and could not comfortably reach his cheek. Clara was different from James Robert in every way that a person can be different while sharing the same parents. She was quiet where he was loud, watchful where he was demonstrative, and she had Luke's gray eyes and the particular expression around them that, from her earliest weeks, looked very much as if she was deciding something. Thomas was 17 when Clara was born, and had the look of a young man who has been given responsibility and finds it agreeable. He held Clara with the careful confidence of someone who has been holding James Robert for 2 years and knows what he is doing. James Robert, at 2 years old, investigated Clara with the thorough pragmatism of a very small scientist, and then announced that she was his and sat next to her basket with the proprietary air of someone who has claimed territory, which everyone found both charming and slightly hilarious. The Wilcox farm, which was what people in Caldwell called the combined properties now, the Beckett farm having been absorbed into the Wilcox household by name if not by deed, was one of the more successful agricultural operations in the county by 1882. The cattle herd was healthy and growing. The kitchen garden produced more than they could use, and the surplus went to the store in town. Cruz had taken on a permanent role and a fair wage, and a small cabin on the property that Luke had built for him the previous year, because Cruz had earned something permanent and knew the land as well as anyone. Thomas turned 18 that year and began taking on the management of the adjacent 80 acres, Luke's original purchase, with a competence that Luke found both satisfying and quietly impressive. He had his mother's head for numbers and his own instinct for land, and the combination was formidable. He had also, in the previous year, begun spending time in the company of a young woman in town named Harriet, the daughter of the hardware store owner, who was 17 and had the direct, capable manner of someone who has grown up around practical people and absorbed their quality. Edith had met Harriet and found her excellent, and had said so to Thomas with the straightforward approval that Thomas had come to understand was his mother's highest compliment. The spring of 1883 was a fine one, following a winter that had been cold but manageable, and Luke stood at the fence on a morning in April, the same fence he had stood at with Edith 3 years before, looking at new grass, and looked at the same view, which was different now in the way that things are different when they have been tended and have grown. The cattle were doing well. The houses were solid. The children were healthy. Thomas was 18 and learning the land. James Robert was 3 and learning everything else with the comprehensive enthusiasm of a person for whom the world is new and interesting. Clara was a year old and watching the world with the patient assessment of a very old soul in a very new body. Edith came out to where he was standing and stood beside him the way she had stood beside him through the seasons, present and solid and entirely herself. 5 years ago, she said, I was standing at a bank door with everything I owned in a cotton pouch and a jaw set for a fight. You won the fight, he said. We won it, she said, in the tone she used when she meant something precisely and wants it heard precisely. He looked at her in the April morning light, which was doing what April light does in Kansas, making everything simple and clean and possible. I stood behind you, he said. You went through the door. You made sure the door stayed open, she said. She reached over and took his hand, which was rougher than when he had arrived in Caldwell 5 years before and had more work in it, and held it the way she had held her coffee cup that first morning, with the completeness of someone who knows what they have and does not intend to let it go. They stood at the fence for a while without talking, because they had been talking for 5 years and had said most of what needed to be said, and the rest of it did not require words. The meadowlark was at it again, from somewhere across the creek, still more enthusiastic than technically precise, still making up for it with commitment. The cattle were moving slowly through the new grass. Somewhere behind them in the house, James Robert was explaining something to Clara at considerable volume, and from the quality of the sound, Clara was being patient about it. This was the Wilcox farm in April of 1883, in Caldwell, Kansas, at the edge of a prairie that went on, until it became the kind of distance that reminds a person of how small they are, and how large their life can be anyway. Thomas married Harriet in June of that year, in the same church where Luke and Edith had been married, with the same Reverend Coleman, who was getting older but no less warm, and the same fiddle player Du Bois, who was also getting older and whose fiddling had acquired a depth that more than compensated for whatever speed it had lost. Me came to this wedding too, and declared it even better than the previous one, which everyone knew was impossible but accepted graciously. Thomas and Harriet settled on the 80 acres, the house that Luke had built, which Thomas had been improving steadily for 2 years with the particular investment of a young man who is building something he intends to keep. Harriet's father gave them a good start in the way of tools and stock, because he was a practical man who understood the value of a practical foundation, and because he had taken to Thomas with the enthusiasm of a man who has 3 daughters and has been hoping for someone sensible to come along. The main house, the original Beckett farmhouse, became what it had quietly been for years, the center. It was where the family gathered for the meals that mattered and the conversations that needed more than 2 people. It was where James Robert tore through the rooms with the comprehensive energy of a 4-year-old who has no interest in being anywhere in particular, but a great deal of interest in all of it at once. It was where Clara sat by the window in the afternoons with the composed watchfulness that was entirely her own, looking out at whatever there was to see and seeing more of it than most. Luke built Edith a proper writing desk that autumn, from good hardwood he had ordered from a mill in Wichita, because she had been keeping the farm's accounts on the kitchen table for 5 years, and he thought she deserved a proper surface for the work she gave so much care to. He built it over 3 weekends when she was at her sister's in town, and when she came home and saw it in the corner of the sitting room, she stopped in the doorway and looked at it for a long moment without saying anything. Then she turned to look at him, and the expression on her face was one of the finest things he had ever seen, not dramatic, not theatrical, but entirely real, the expression of a person who has been seen accurately and feels the particular warmth of that. "You measured the corner," she said. "3 times," he said. She went to the desk and ran her hand along the top of it, feeling the grain of the wood and the smoothness of the finish, and then she opened the small drawer in the front, which he had fitted with a brass pull, and looked inside and looked back at him. "It's perfect," she said. "So are you," he said simply, and he meant it in the comprehensive way that a person means it when they have known someone long enough to know what perfect actually looks like, which is not flawless but is whole, is present, is entirely and unapologetically itself. She crossed the room to where he was standing and put her arms around him, and he held her the way you hold the things that are most important, carefully and completely. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was a hard one. The temperatures dropped in December and stayed down, and the cattle required constant management, and the water sources had to be kept free of ice every morning, and the work was relentless in the way that winter work on a farm is always relentless. But they had Cruz and Thomas and Harriet and the resources of 2 solid operations, and they came through it without catastrophic loss, which was the best that could be said of any Kansas winter, and was, in fact, enough. James Robert turned 4 in November and spent the winter asserting himself on every available surface, with the comprehensive ambition of a small person who intends to be large. He had opinions about the horses, which Luke took seriously. He had opinions about the chickens, which the chickens ignored. He had opinions about his sister's hat, which Clara corrected with a patience that was remarkable in a 2-year-old, and which she delivered with a look that silenced him more effectively than any adult had managed. Clara turned 2 in February in the middle of the cold, and was given a stuffed rabbit that Edith had made from scraps of good cloth, which Clara received with the solemn appreciation of someone who recognizes quality and intends to honor it. She named the rabbit Henry, which no one had suggested, and everyone found inexplicable and perfect. Spring came as it always did, without asking permission and without apology. The grass came up green, and the creek ran fast with snowmelt, and the meadowlark was back, the same one or its children, doing the same work with the same commitment. Luke stood at the fence on the first genuinely warm morning of April and felt the year turn under his feet, the way it had turned every year he had stood on this land, and the feeling was one he had never found an adequate word for because it was not quite happiness and it was not quite contentment. It was something older than both of those things, something that had to do with being exactly where you were supposed to be. Edith came out of the house with 2 cups of coffee, which she handed to him without ceremony, and stood beside him as she always did, present and solid and entirely herself. "Thomas says the south pasture fence needs work on the east corner," she said. "I know," he said. "I'll look at it this week." "Harriet is expecting," she said. He turned to look at her. "When did you find out?" "This morning," she said. "Harriet told me. She is about 3 months along. She is hoping for a girl." He looked back at the pasture. "They'll be good parents," he said. "They will," she agreed. "They are already good people, which is most of it." James Robert appeared at the porch door and announced, with the authority of a 4-year-old who is certain of his information, that Clara had put Henry the rabbit in the water bucket, which was both improbable and apparently true, and Edith went to address this with the unhurried competence of someone who has managed improbable things for years and found them manageable. Luke stood at the fence a moment longer, drinking his coffee, looking at the land. His land. Their land. The land that Edith had held with both hands and refused to surrender, that he had stood behind her to help protect, that they had built a life on together, one good day at a time, one sound decision at a time, one honest conversation at a time. It was not the life he had imagined at 17, riding out of East Texas with everything he owned in a pair of saddlebags and a direction that was mostly north. It was better than that. It was better because it was actual, because it had weight to it, because it was built on real ground with real people who were genuinely themselves, which was rarer than most people understood. He heard Edith's laugh from inside the house, the particular laugh she had when something was genuinely funny rather than politely funny, full and warm and immediate. He heard James Robert contributing additional information at volume. He heard Clara's small, serious voice providing a correction. He set down his empty cup on the fence post. He went inside to his family. Thomas and Harriet's son was born in October of 1884. They named him Robert Lucas Wilcox, and if the names caused a particular quality of silence at the kitchen table when Thomas announced them, it was the kind of silence that is very full rather than very empty. Edith had pressed her lips together and looked at her son for a moment and then said, "That is a fine name," in a voice that was steady and warm and carried everything it needed to carry without needing anything else said. Luke had shaken Thomas's hand and then, because Thomas was 18 and a married man and a father, and had been all of those things with seriousness and grace, he put his arm around the young man's shoulders, briefly, in the way of men who do not easily say the things they feel but find other ways of saying them, and Thomas had stood still for it, which was his way of saying the same thing back. The years moved on the way the years do, not slowly and not quickly, but at exactly the speed that living requires. Cruz stayed on the land until 1887, when he retired to live with his daughter in a town further south, and at his going, there was a supper and a speech from Luke that was brief and accurate, and from Edith that was longer and equally accurate, and Cruz shook every hand at the table including James Roberts, who was 7 and shook it with great seriousness, and Clara's, who was 5 and shook it with the gravity of a diplomat. James Robert grew into a boy of strong opinions and strong muscles, and the particular combination of his father's steadiness and his mother's clarity that made him, by age 8, someone whose company adults found genuinely interesting, which he received with the modesty of someone who has been raised to believe that being interesting is fine, but being useful is better. Clara grew into a girl who read everything she could find and asked questions that neither Luke nor Edith could always answer, which they considered a good sign. She had opinions about land management that were, by the time she was 6, not entirely without merit. She had opinions about the chickens that were, by that same age, significantly more practical than most of the chickens deserved. She was quiet in the way that very attentive people are quiet, not because they have nothing to say, but because they are waiting until saying it will matter. In the summer of 1886, Edith told Luke she was expecting again. She told him at the writing desk, where she had been going over the account books, because she had done the arithmetic first, the way she did everything, and wanted to be certain before she said it. She was 38 years old and she said so, and he said that he was 42 and they were both therefore still entirely reasonable, and she laughed in the way she laughed when something was genuinely funny to her. Their second son, William Henry Wilcox, arrived in February of 1887, in what was becoming, me at Haverson's observed, a family tradition of February babies. He was a healthy boy with Edith's coloring and the Wilcox stubbornness, which manifested early and comprehensively, and was going to be interesting to raise. James Robert, who was 7, inspected him with the authority of an experienced older sibling and declared him acceptable. Clara, who was 5, looked at him for a long time and said, "Hello, William," in the serious voice she used for things that mattered, and William blinked at her with the unfocused attention of a very new person encountering someone who intends to be important to him. The town of Caldwell changed considerably through the late 1880s as the great cattle drives began to wind down. The railroads were pushing further south, and the Kishom Trail was losing its preeminence as the primary route north, and the character of the town shifted from the roughness of a trail stop to the more settled energy of a community that was becoming what it intended to be permanently. The bank was still there, still managed by Combs, who had become noticeably more careful in his dealings with documented loan holders since the conversation with Fletcher's board committee, and who nodded to Edith with a respect that was marginally more genuine than it had been when he had tried to add unauthorized fees to her account. The farm in 1889, which was 11 years after the morning at the bank, was a different thing from what it had been, not in character but in fullness. The main house was larger, having been extended twice to accommodate the family. Thomas and Harriet's spread on the 80 acres was its own complete thing, with their Robert Lucas now 5 years old and a baby daughter named Me, because Harriet had wanted to name her for someone who had been kind, and Edith had told her about the coffee that first morning, and Harriet had said, without hesitation, that it was exactly right. Luke was 53. His hair was mostly gray, and he moved with the slight deliberateness of a man whose joints have been informed by decades of outdoor work in variable weather. But he was sound, and he was strong, and he was, in the way that mattered most, unchanged from the man who had stood behind a woman at a bank door in the spring of 1878 and said nothing, and meant everything he was not saying. Edith was 42. She was not the woman who had stood at the bank door with a jaw set for a fight, and she was entirely that woman, because the fight was still in her, and the jaw was still there when it was needed. But around those things was everything that had grown up alongside them over 11 years, the love and the work and the children and the land and the man who had chosen to stand behind her, and then, when she had let him, to stand beside her. She found him one evening in late October, sitting on the porch of the original house, the house that had always been the center, watching the last light go from gold to red over the western fields. She sat beside him in the chair she had put there 10 years ago, and the boards of the porch were known under her feet, and the air was cool with the coming winter and smelled of dry grass and distance. "Do you remember what you said the first time you came here?" she asked. "I said Thomas had good judgment," he said. "After that," she said. He thought for a moment. "I said that I had been thinking vaguely about what came after the trail." "You said you had been thinking about something that stayed put," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at the fields, the cattle moving in the far pasture, the light doing what it did at the end of the day, making everything look like something worth keeping. "Did it work out the way you thought?" she asked. He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved because she was a woman who asked real questions and had no use for easy answers. "Better," he said. "It worked out better. I thought about land. I thought about something permanent. I did not think clearly enough about what makes a thing permanent." "What makes it permanent?" she asked. "This," he said, and his hand moved in a gesture that took in the porch and the fields and the house behind them and the sounds coming from it, which were currently James Robert explaining something to William with more confidence than accuracy while Clara corrected him from somewhere nearby. "People who stay. People who build things that last because they are worth lasting. You." She turned to look at him, and in the fading October light her face was the face he had been looking at for 11 years, and it was still the most interesting face he had ever encountered, and he expected it always would be. "You stood behind me," she said. "At the bank. You did not know me. You did not owe me anything." "No," he said. "Why?" she said. She had never asked it directly before. In 11 years she had never asked it. He thought about it honestly, the way the moment deserved. "Because you were standing there alone," he said, "with everything important to you in your pocket, and you were not afraid, and you were not asking for anything, and something in that was," he stopped, because the word he wanted was not in the category of words he reached for easily. "It was right," he said finally. You were doing something right. Standing behind you was the right thing to be doing." She looked at him for a long moment with the clear, measuring quality he had first seen at the bank, and that he had spent 11 years knowing was the truest thing about her. Then she said, "I think you were right, too." She put her hand in his, and he held it, and they sat on the porch in the October evening while the light finished its work, and the sky came down dark and brilliant over the Kansas prairie. And behind them in the house the sounds of their life continued, warm and full and ordinary in the best possible way. The stars came out the way they always did over that flat and extraordinary land, in their extraordinary numbers, without ceremony and without end. The cattle were still. The creek made its sound. The meadowlark was quiet because it was evening, and the meadowlark kept reasonable hours. Edith Beckett Wilcox and Luke Wilcox sat on their porch in the October dark, and the deed to their land was in the house, in the drawer of the good hardwood writing desk, and it had been free and clear for 11 years, and it would be free and clear after them, passing to Thomas and to James Robert and to Clara and to William, and to all of Robert Lucas and me, and to whoever came after all of them, because the land stays and the people who love it right make it worth staying for. This was the story of a woman who walked up to a bank door before it opened, and held her ground, and walked out with what was hers, and the man who stood behind her and said nothing, and what his presence said, and everything that came after, which was considerable and fine and worth every ordinary and extraordinary day of it.